Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Creative Lifescaping, the mostly live series on how other people who might not seem creative use their creativity to make a better life at home and at work for themselves. It is my great pleasure to welcome today Danielle McCombs. And I met Danielle through my guest who I interviewed this morning, Mark Metry. LinkedIn, again, a great way to find new people. And Danielle holds a master's of real estate from the Schack Institute of New York and works in commercial real estate. Danielle is also a growth-minded individual. She's constantly striving to improve herself and deepen her understanding of the world around her. She hosts the podcast, The Opposite of Small Talk, which I was such a thrill to be a guest on their podcast about a month ago, where her friend Kristy and her explore new ways to grow both personally and professionally. And the podcast website is theoppositeofsmalltalk.com. We're going to dive into that. And welcome, Danielle.
Caroline, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. And did I say your last name? You know, I think I would learn after this many interviews. I always forget, how do I pronounce the last name? Did I get it right?
You nailed it.
Oh, yay. I was like, as I'm like watching the video, I'm like, oh no, do I have time to like ask her? No, I don't. I'll go with it.
I do the same thing. I totally understand.
So tell me a little bit about your path to becoming, like, I didn't even know you could get a master's of real estate. So tell me a little bit about, like, did you want to be a real estate person when you were a kid? Tell me a little bit about what got you to what you're currently doing for your job.
So I think, as most people that are in commercial real estate will tell you, is like nobody woke up like when they were 5 years old and was like, I want to be in commercial real estate. And I was the same. I graduated college and in 2002, and it was in the middle of a recession, and was trying to figure out like, what do I do next? I had a degree in political science, which doesn't really give you much of a career path. And I just happened to get a job working at a not-for-profit that did low and moderate income housing throughout New York. And I was there for 9 years. So was there from when I was 22 till when I was 31, and grew up there basically. And while I was there, decided I like this, and had the opportunity to go to NYU and get my master's. And they subsidized it, and it seemed like an opportunity. Why would I miss out on this? And I will say that working in the industry and going to school at the same time was incredibly helpful. And also, I think, helped me in a big way. I was there from 2007 to 2009, which was basically when commercial real estate collapsed the economy. So it was a really interesting time to be in school, to be learning about like what was happening real time. And the professors there are all commercial real estate professionals. So some of them were getting laid off. Some of them were losing their jobs. And it was it was an interesting time to be there, because you really felt like what was going on at the moment. So, so that was, I kind of fell into real estate. It wasn't a passion of mine. It wasn't what I was looking for. And 19 years later, I'm still doing it.
So yeah, you said you had a degree in political science. So what did you think you were going to do, like through high school or university or college, I guess you call it in the US?
You know what? I don't think I knew really. I will say, when I was a kid, I do remember there was like a time where I was like, I want to be an architect. Oh. And so I do kind of like to think that I do that in some way. Like, I work in finance and commercial real estate. And so I am helping build buildings. I'm giving people the money to do that. So in some way there's that, but like it was never the plan.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Like you say, you like to be an architect, because you probably would never have known, like, can I be the person that helps fund the architect? Like, you wouldn't even know that was a person. Set. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I love that. When you were a child, do you think you were a very creative child? Like, were you someone that was like very artistic, or?
I mean, I took dance lessons and I liked that, but I feel like it was like every other kid. It wasn't that I excelled at dance. It was just like the thing I did, tap and ballet and jazz classes. Art was never my thing. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think I would. And to be honest, Caroline, until talking to you on my podcast, I don't know that I considered myself a creative person, but you made me think of that in a different way.
Oh, Yay me. So it doesn't sound like you ever considered yourself to be very creative, because it sounds like you considered it more of an artistic thing. So how would you define, how did your creativity definition change from, before we talked, I guess, until after?
I think that I always thought that it was like, well, you have to be an artist or a dancer or something that's like considered art, right? Like that's where people are creative. And
Mhm.
I realize now that that's not the case. People are creative in a million different ways. And I think I can relate it back to my career in real estate is, I work on pretty complex transactions. And every deal is different. There's not like a cookie cutter deal because when you deal with if you think about it in these terms, every building that you work on has its own life. And so there's never going to be the same things, and a different problem is going to show up on every building. And in every deal, there's so many moving parts that there's always going to be something different that shows up. So I think in that, being creative with the way you make solutions when you're working with a bank and there's an environmental issue or there's a credit issue or there's all these different things, and you need to have a creative mind to figure out like, okay, well, how can we get everyone comfortable here and get to the finish line so that the one part of this transaction, which is the money, it's a pretty big part of it, can be we can close this deal and make this happen so that we can do all of the other things can happen well. So I think it's just using your brain in a different way. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like making a beautiful painting, right? It could be closing a commercial mortgage loan.
Yeah. And it sounds like, I don't really know how all of those moving pieces work together, but it sounds like it's maybe being creative in the language that you're using to represent the risk or the environmental things, so that it's like, okay, well, how can we make everybody happy, and how can we put these pieces together in like, a legitimate but also creative way so that everybody's happy. That's very creative. I think it's just like you said, most people wouldn't consider that to be creative.
Yeah. And me, myself didn't either until talking to you. So thank you for changing my mind in that way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having your mind changed. So tell me more about, so help me bridge, I guess it's with your friend, Kristy. Tell me how you went from commercial real estate to having a podcast called The Opposite of Small Talk, which I'm going to put up the link here so people can find it.
Thank you. It also same thing is that this was not a plan. It never was. Kristy and I went to college together. And she works at a bank. So neither of us have fallen to like specifically creative fields. Right. Mm-hmm. And she sent me a text message one day and said, "Hey, do you want to start a podcast with me?" And my response was, "About what? Like, what are we going to talk about? I don't, And she was like, "That's the wrong answer. You're supposed to just say yes." And so I just said yes. And it's been such an amazing thing. And I think that's actually taken so much that's made me feel like a more creative person, because I feel like I'm putting something out into the world. But it's just been such a great thing. It's a great thing for us to do together. It's built our relationship immensely, but also has made me be introduced to people like you and other people that are just in this field that do all different things and talk about things that are about being growth minded and knowing that you can constantly learn new things and what that means. And so I feel like it set me on a totally different path of being open to being growth minded and knowing that what I know today is not going to be the same as what I know tomorrow. And the things that I do can change because of that.
Yeah, I love that sense of agency. It sounds like you're building over your decisions, right? But that you have control. But it just sounds so random. Like, and I have a thing with Kristy and Kirsty, so I'm probably going to call it's Kirsty, I think, right? Kristy. See, I think I have it, and then I'm like, no, must be opposite. So Kristy, so this sounds very random. Like neither of you are creative. Neither of you, it sounds like you're in the performing arts or even journalism or anything like that. So what the heck? How did that start? Like what?
Yeah, I credit Kristy with the idea. And it honestly has been such an amazing thing too, because I don't think we knew how well we would work together. And what I've realized, and we didn't necessarily set out to, we've been doing this for 2 years now. We just did our 50th episode. and are looking forward to, you know, so much more to come. And we've evolved. And I think some of the things that I'm our talent scout. So I go out and I try to meet people and find people to bring on the podcast and different people to talk to and different topics to talk to. And Kristy makes the whole thing work. She does the editing and the recording, and she publishes it, and she does our social media. And we both really like those things and excel at them. So it's been really nice and we couldn't have, it wasn't from the beginning that we were like, okay, here's what we're going to do. It just kind of evolved that way. And we both gave each other the latitude to do both things and found the thing that we liked to do. And it just happened to be completely complementary. So I think it was being open to, we don't really know what we're doing here. It's something that we want to try. And then being open to how it evolved. And so we do say all the time, like, you have to start before you're ready. And we were absolutely not ready. We were terrified when we launched our first podcast and was like, what are we doing? What are we saying? Who's going to listen to this? Why are we even bothering? And we just took the approach of, we need to just put it out there and we need to just do it. And like, the worst that happens is nobody listens to it, and that's okay. Like, it's not a big deal, but we've actually found like a really great following, and we've met so many incredible people who want to talk to us and want to talk about what they do. And that's just been beyond what I ever could have imagined.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you kind of sounds like you both were very willing to step into the ambiguity. And, you know, Brene Brown talks about like, it has to be more painful to stay on the ground than to jump or something, or the other way around.
Like making a change is when you're it's more painful to stay where you are than to actually like break out. It's less scary, right? To make that change.
Yeah. And as you're telling me your story of like figuring things out and, you know, discovering your talents and being flexible enough to like own that and not being stubborn, like one of you, like, no, I'm the one that does this. This is like my identity is around like editing or something. It just sounds like you basically jumped and built your parachute on the way down.
Yeah. And I think we're still doing that today. Like, we still are, you know, it's been 2 years, but there's different things we want to do. And we're not sure that necessarily fits into what we've done in the past, but we'll give it a try. And like, the worst that happens is we fall on our face and we get back up. And in the big picture of things, what keeps me going in that is like, nobody's paying that much attention.
Yes.
So if we fall down, nobody's going to notice, you know, and like, and change. If we have a really terrible episode or we pivot in some way and then people stop listening, and we can go back, and that's okay.
I love that. I say that I'm writing a book that's hopefully coming out in December. And in the book, you know, it was a tagline I was playing with, is nobody really cares that much about what you do anyway. You know, I love that sense of like, and for me, I always have that Ken Leong, I never am saying his name right, from The Hangover, where there's that scene where like he's meeting up with the other guys and they're like, we had such a bad day. And he's like, but did you die? Because like they thought he died. So every time I have that idea, like, what's the worst that can happen? I'm like, but did you die? Like,
exactly. And that's the thing, is if everybody will just take the first leap and not be so scared, like, it's amazing the things that can happen. Like, I feel like in the last 2 years, my life has changed immensely. And it was because I answered yes to that text message. And I credit that to so many changes in my life, and so much that, like, you know, we've done, we actually just did it in September, and we're going to do it again in January. We do a growth mindset challenge, and it's app based. And so it takes 5 to 15 minutes a day. You go on, there's a growth mindset oath. There's some different like TED Talks and stuff that you listen to. There's a place to put your gratitudes for the day, things that you're curious about. And it just kind of makes you think of things in a different way, so that you're like rewiring your brain to be curious and to be growth minded. And that's helped me so much, because there's days where you're like, ugh, I don't want to do this thing. This stinks. Or I don't know how to do this and I'm not going to be good at it. And I have to remind myself, like, I am a growth minded person and I talk about this all the time. So guess what? Like, get your stuff together.
Yeah. Figure it out. Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, so your story probably sounds very familiar to people who are listening, who might think they're not creative, and they obviously know they need to, whether it's for personal well-being or just for being more competitive in the jobs this decade. How would you say for you and Kristy, like, how would you tell somebody else to go about that same change that you guys did? I know Kristy in this case had the idea and you said yes, but what are the things that might have gotten in the way or that you overcame to push forward and to create this podcast that's been going for 2 years very successfully?
I think it's one, start before you're ready. So there's an idea. You can't wait until the timing is perfect. The timing will never be perfect for anything, right? And if we keep waiting, all we're doing is holding ourselves back. And so I think if we had waited till we were like, well, we need to know everything we know about how a podcast works and how you edit a podcast. If we had to learn all of that stuff, we would still be waiting. And all of the things that we've experienced in the last 2 years never would have happened. So we would have been on, I guess, a lot of Zoom calls talking about stuff that we didn't do. And so that's one of the things that we've taken. And every time something new comes up, we're like, all right, we're just going to do it. And Kristy has one saying that she says, like, fear means go. You're afraid of it? Let's do it. Because otherwise we can sit and we can talk about how afraid we are. We can wait until that we think the timing is right. And it just, I think you have to choose the thing that you want to do over the fear. And once you do it, it's not that scary. Like now, this is something, talking to you like this 2 years ago, I don't know that I would have done this, right? I mean, I would have been afraid to do it. And now I'm happy to put myself out there because number one, no one's paying that much attention. So if I say something crazy here, like, you know, like I hope that people get something great out of this. But at the same time, if I totally mess up, soon no one's going to remember this and they'll remember something else that I've done, right?
Or maybe the mistake is what catalyzed them to change something because of whatever the case, right? So,
yeah. And that's a great way to think of it too, is people learning from other people's mistakes. I think we do that all the time. So I think it's just the one thing is like start before you're ready. And I would say actually, I'm remembering our first episode was actually about creativity. And I was like, I'm not a creative person. I don't know what we're doing. And what we kind of came away with, and the tagline in that too was Kristy's brother also has a podcast. And I was like, everyone in there, right? Everyone and Kristy's brother has a podcast, right? So what are we doing that's anything different here? And the thing that we kind of came away with was, well, we all have our own experiences. So even if we read the same Brene Brown book, or we watch the same documentary, or we watch the same TV show, right? We all come away with something different because of our own personal experiences. And that filter that it goes through, you can then share with other people what that meant for your filter, right? Like how did that work? So I think that that's really important too, is to realize just because you don't feel like you're a creative person, or you feel like the things that I read and listen to and whatever is like, I'm not just regurgitating what I hear, I'm regurgitating it, what has gone through my filter and the way that I believe it because of all of the other books that I've read or personal experiences that I've had.
Yeah. And that's so true. I mean, someone could hear that same message from Kristy's brother's podcast and 7 other people, but they might not understand or embed that idea unless it comes through a filter like yours that aligns particularly with whatever they're thinking about. And, I love this idea of people worrying what you're saying about it doesn't have to be completely unique, because people think, oh, it's not creative because it's like, an idea that someone else has had in some way. And one of my favorite quotes, which is so ironic that there's no source, is creativity is plagiarism undiscovered.
I love that.
So, nobody's doing anything new. If you think you're doing something new, it's because you haven't found the person that had that idea before.
Right.
Like even when I had a jewelry business, it was snap jewelry where you put like little pieces in it and stuff. Anyway, I mean, and there was a few other companies around at the time, but then when I was at shows, older ladies would come up and they're like, oh, we used to have this in like the 50s. It was like a gem. And I was like, really? Like, it's not a unique idea. Like all of these ideas have already been come up with, but just the way you present them to people is your unique, I call it the universe brain. Like your brain is a unique universe with all of your experiences, and your podcast comes from that, and nobody else can do it like that. So I think that's very metaphorical for creativity. So thank you for sharing that.
Of course. Yeah. And I just think that, right, like you have to think of the things that you've heard a million times and then somebody says it and you're like, oh, now I understand that. Right. Yes. So I don't know, maybe my voice helps that in some way, where when somebody else says it, it doesn't make sense. And I feel like that's happened to me a million times, where I've read a bunch of books that are all about the same thing. And then you read one more and you're like, oh, that clicked that time, or that made sense. And then it all comes back together. So
yeah, I've had that same experience. I've often wondered if I read this book first, would I have gotten it? Or is it because I read all those other books that now this one makes sense, right? So,
right. It's a cumulative effect too, right?
yeah. So when you're talking about being creative, like whether it's at work with real estate or with a podcast, what are your biggest obstacles to creativity? Do you notice anything, and how do you overcome them?
I think one is thinking that I'm not a creative person, right? I think that that's like step one, is thinking like, oh, well, this is, or thinking that everything has, I guess, or like facing a problem thinking like, well, this has never been done before and we're never going to figure it out. And at some point, something close has happened, right? Where you can kind of bring it together and say like, all right, like, well, I learned this here and I learned that there. And if we put those two solutions together, like then we can get to some place that works. But I think, yeah, just not, I mean, even when you asked me to do this, I was like, Caroline, I'm not a creative person. And I still think, right, like, but that's in my brain. But now we just had a 20-minute conversation about how I am creative. So I need to believe what I'm saying.
Yeah. And it doesn't sound like you're quite there yet.
Yeah. It's just, I don't know. And I don't know when maybe somebody else has to say it some other way and I'll really get there. But I think we all have
holding you back. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think we all have the things, right? Of what are the one thing that holds you back in some way, or even though I hear that in my head, I'm still doing the things.
I was going to say, like, it's not holding you back. You're still doing it. So what do you think helps you? Is it what you like, going back to what you said about just doing it and realizing nobody cares that much? Is that what helps you get over those fears?
Yeah, I think that is really helpful. And then once you get some positive feedback from people that are like, oh, I really like your podcast. I really like what you're doing. And then it's like, okay, well, I like doing it too. So I'm going to keep doing it and see what happens. And I think if you can reflect a little bit of the things that have happened, right? Like I can reflect back on 2 years ago, Danielle was definitely a different person. And so I think taking that time to do that as well is really important, because you can see the progress that you've made. So I think when I get stuck, I need to think about like, okay, well, let's think back to, 2019 Danielle or 2015 Danielle and who that person was and how she's different now. And all of the things that I've done that I was scared of at the time that now I don't even think of as a scary thing because it's in the past.
Yeah, it sounds like I find what helps me, it sounds like it's similar to what you're doing, if I'm understanding you right, is like looking for the evidence. Like, as much as I'm like, oh, people are going to hate this, or this is dumb, or whatever, I'm not creative, whatever the case is. And I'm like, wait, I have a brain here. Let me think about like, really, what's the evidence to show that that is true? And in your case, like, you've built a successful podcast for over 2 years, you've curated, there's so much creativity. So even if you were to look at it from someone else's point of view, you could say, well, there's no evidence here to say that I'm not creative, but it's just getting past that like self-identity that we get so stuck with.
Yes. I think, right. I think you're right. Like, people get very stuck in what their identity is of, I'm Danielle and I'm not a creative person. And now I have to remember, like, no, I'm Danielle and I host a podcast and I talk to all these really interesting people and I'm learning all these new things. And I've learned so much that I would like to share that with other people and find that that's important, as opposed to just sitting in the box of, I'm not creative, so I guess I can't do anything.
Yeah. Tell me about how a workplace might impact that self-identity, because I wonder, well, just for my example, like being a veterinarian, and I had a jewelry business and I was doing comedy, I didn't really want to tell, the other vets that I was doing that, because I'm like, I think that's weird. That's like so not what a vet looks like. Tell me what you think about like that idea of like your identity being, kind of hemmed in by your workplace, and how that impacts your idea of being creative.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that absolutely. When Kristy and I launched the podcast, both of us had started new jobs very like within the same couple months that we were launching the podcast. And at first we were really worried to like mention it or to put it up on LinkedIn, because we were like, well, what are they going to think this means? And I can't remember what episode we had, some episode, and we were like, this fits LinkedIn. Like, we need to put this out there, and this is a great way to grow our audience. And we were both super scared about it. Like, we had a conversation of like, all right, are we going to do this? And people are going to know we do this now. And we did. And all that it has been people being like, oh, wow, that's really cool. Right. Like, that's a really great thing you do on the side. You know, it's not something that I'm still doing my job. And for some reason I thought that like, well, no, my job has to be the thing that I do.
Yeah.
And anything outside of that, like I can't open that up. And so I think that was like a big fear. And like no one, once again, either no one noticed it or cared or said, hey, that's great. I'd really love to listen. And like, and then I started sharing different episodes with people that I work with. And it's just like, now I'm showing more of who I am, of my whole self, as opposed to this is work Danielle. And then this is, you know, personal Danielle or podcast Danielle. So I think being able to share that, and I think I'm doing something that adds to, like, I'm bringing a better self to work than I would be otherwise, because I'm growing and getting to know all these new things, building new skills.
Yeah. I think that's my experience too. And I love that. I wonder, do you think that like managers and, you know, leaders recognize this? Or do you think that there's a recognition that we need to bring more of our human selves to work? Or do you think there's a preference for like, you know, everybody just be their work Danielle self?
Right. For myself, I think it's hugely important that everybody bring their whole self to work. And I one of the things that I hope that comes out of the last year and a half, 20 months, whatever it's been at this point that we've been, you know, in this pandemic, that everybody sees each other as a human and not as like a cog in a wheel, because we've all gone through this common human experience. Like no one got out of here scot-free that this didn't happen. We've all gone through it, and everyone's been in each other's homes, whether I wanted my boss there or not. He was in my house, right? Like everybody's been, via Zoom, everybody's been. And so you've had to see people's humanity in a way that, you know, was like, oh, you know, somebody just opened the door, or my cat just jumped on the table, or my kid is crying in the back, right? Like when you go to an office, you can leave those things at home and you don't have to bring them up. You don't have to talk about them. But now it's very, you know, I think we had to see that we were all human and also going through something at the same time, like in real time, and everybody being very uncertain of what was going on or what happens next. And I think that has brought a place where people can talk about, like, to see the humanity in each other. And I hope that that continues and is something that's encouraged going forward.
Yeah. And it sounds like, you know, we've definitely seen the benefits of seeing each other as humans as far as workers go. Do you think there's a way, or what is your, maybe, you know, just off the top of my head, is there a way to assign an ROI to that? Like, can we say, you know, the increased humanity is helping people work better together, or like, you know, whatever the ROI that they're always looking at, or should they even be looking at that?
Yeah, I think you have to also look, right? Like businesses have continued, like everything, as much as the world stopped, the world continued to turn, right? Like people were still working, people have still been productive. And I know I know that I'm coming from a place of like privilege of like, oh, I still have a job. And a lot of people were not that lucky, right? A lot of people lost their jobs and a lot of people have suffered real hardship. But I think that as things start coming back, people also had time to stop and think about, like, what is really important to me? Yeah. What are the things that I need? And do I need to work 80 hours a week, or should I be home with my family? And can I do both, right? Yeah. Can I work from home and still then have time, take an hour and have dinner with my family and then come back and finish what I need to do? But like things were still getting done and business was still happening. And so I think people need to realize that, like, people need to be given flexibility of maybe you don't need to do your job from 8 to 6 sitting in an office, right? Maybe you do your job when it fits you flexibly, right? And I think that is the thing that I hope comes out of this as well, is that we realize being more flexible to people, you also get a lot more out of people, right? When people feel as though they're being seen and heard, and also understand, hey, we get you're working hard, and maybe, you know, you can't jump on that 8 a.m. call because you have to bring your kid to school. Like, I think noticing that in people, but we know that you want to be on the 9 o'clock call as soon as you're back. Like, I think, and just realizing that people have families and people have other responsibilities and people have lives outside of the office. And if that's respected, you're going to get more out of your employees.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those for both leaders who are making these decisions, but also people working. And that's the problem with creativity, is we get stuck in doing the same things the same way because that we just don't know any different. And the pandemic, for the fortunate people who, haven't suffered like you mentioned, they're like, oh, well, I can work this way. I never, if they hadn't been forced to, they never would have. So now it opens this whole, like, what else am I missing about how my life could be that I didn't know before because I was just so stuck in this, I have to work 80 hours a week thing. So I think it's opened our eyes that, and sometimes that's what they talk about, the constraints of creativity. Sometimes you don't change until you have to. Like, do you remember that video that went viral with the guy with his daughter that ran into the room when he was being interviewed? It was before the pandemic. And it was like this big, huge, hilarious thing. Like now it's just like, that was my Tuesday.
Right. Right. Like, of course that happens. Right. Like,
exactly. Yeah. Oh, this has been wonderful, Danielle. Thank you so much for sharing your journey from, a reformed non-creative to a creative. And I'm not going to forget our last thing. You selected a dare for truth or dare section. And I've been thinking about what I'm going to dare you to do. So I am going to dare you to describe because it's Thanksgiving in the US coming up, right?
It is.
I'm always like, when's Black Monday? Because our Thanksgiving in Canada here was like a month ago. So, so it's like, for your upcoming US Thanksgiving, tell me what the menu would be if you were serving to a bunch of aliens.
Ooh. So I have to preface this with, Thanksgiving is actually my favorite meal. Like, it is my favorite meal ever. So like, I would think I want to show the aliens just how good real American Thanksgiving is. So it would be like all of the traditional, but also with like the caveats of like what my family does, right? So, it would be turkey, of course, cranberry, but in a can, so it still has the ridges from the can on it. Stovetop stuffing, and sweet potato pie with marshmallows on top.
Ooh.
Yeah. And then and mashed potatoes, and then probably some sort of like delicious chocolate something for dessert. But yeah, I think because this is my favorite meal, and then there would also be the leftovers the next day that you took all of that and you made it into a sandwich. Yeah. So both of those things they would have to experience.
I love it. Okay, so I'm going to put a constraint. So I'm going to do this ladder technique where you go, I love that. That sounds delicious. By the way, little story about sweet potato pie. As a Canadian, I would never really had that. When I went to Florida and I was working Emerge, the manager brought in Thanksgiving dinner for us. And I'm like, why are we eating dessert with dinner? I never had it. So, but for the constraints, let's say that the aliens are turkeys. What would you serve?
Oh.
Would you still serve a turkey? What would you do?
Well, I mean, that raises a lot of really weird issues, right? So I don't want to
actual turkeys, or like turkey aliens. So what would you do?
Right. So, but they're right. But like, you don't want to, that's rude, right? You don't want to serve something that looks like you at Thanksgiving dinner. That kind of ruins that. So then I would have to go with like my second favorite, which would be probably just like a seafood smorgasbord.
Ooh.
Like, so like, oysters and clams and shrimp and lobster, all of that kind of stuff. I guess that would be, if I can't give them turkey, then we'll have that.
Yeah. I spent a Christmas in Australia, and their traditional Christmas is shrimp on the Barbie. Yeah.
I need to. I actually spent a Thanksgiving in Australia, but ate a turkey sandwich, I think. But maybe I need to go back for Christmas.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I'm coming to your house for Thanksgiving. I think I'm allowed to come there now.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I'm allowed to come there by flying anyway, but not by road until sometime in November. So it seems
well,
weird.
you're more than
fly and not drive. I don't understand that. So
I guess they don't know where you stop. I don't know.
Anyway, it's all a mystery to me. I just do what people tell me. So thank you so much for sharing your alien Thanksgiving dinner. And thank you so much for sharing all of your creative ideas and how to get over your creativity and build a successful podcast. Again, you can find Danielle and Kristy at The Opposite of Small Talk at theoppositeofsmalltalk.com. And then I will get a link from Danielle to put in the notes that will take you to like the podcast streamer thingy bit, so you can pick what platform you like. And if you have any questions about this, please feel free to put it in the comments below, or to reach out to me or Danielle on LinkedIn. And thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you, Caroline. This was such a pleasure.
Thanks. Bye.